In this video, we are going to learn how to create a function that returns a new function. This is very powerful and useful feature of JavaScript as it allows us to create higher order functions, closures, and currying. And if you are not familiar with these terms, don't worry, we will explain them along the way. But first, let's see what we mean by a function that returns a new function. Now, a function that returns a new function is simply a function that has another function as its return value. For example, let's define a function called makeGreeting that takes a string parameter called name and returns a function that greets that name. So function makeGreeting. Now this function has one parameter which is name. Now here this function will return a new function which is an anonymous function because as you can see this function don't have any name. Now here this function will only log to our console hello then the person name like this. Now as you can see this makeGreeting function returns a function that uses this name parameter to print a greeting message. This means that we can store this return function in a variable and we will call it later. For example, let's create a function called greetAlice by calling makeGreeting with the argument Alice. So let greetAlice is equal to makeGreeting. Then here for our name we are going to use Alice like this. Now we have a function which is called greetAlice that we can use to greet Alice. Now if we call this function, you can see in our console we have hello Alice. Now we can also create other functions by calling this makeGreeting function with different argument. For example, let's create a function called greetBob by calling makeGreeting with the argument of Bob. Let greetBob is equal to makeGreeting and here for this name we are going to use Bob. Now we have another function which is greetBob. Now if we call this function, you can see we have hello Bob. So now we have created two different functions by calling the same function with different arguments. This is our first function and this is our second function. This is one of the benefits of creating a function that returns a new function. We can reuse the same logic with different parameters. This is also known as currying, which is a technique of transforming a function that takes multiple arguments into a sequence of functions that each take a single argument. Now another benefit of creating a function that returns a new function is that we can create closures, which are functions that remember the environment in which they were created. For example, in our makeGreeting function, this return function remembers the name parameter that was passed to it, even after the makeGreeting function has finished executing. This is because this return function has a reference to the name variable in its scope and it can access it whenever it is called. This is also known as lexical scoping, which means that a function can access the variables that are defined in its outer scope. Now, closures are very useful for creating private variables, which are variables that can only be accessed by the function that defines them. For example, let's create a function called makeCounter that returns a function that counts how many times it has been called. So function makeCounter. Now here we are going to create a private variable which is counter, and we are setting it to 0. Now after this we are going to return a function. Now here we are going to increase this counter variable by 1 every time this make counter function will be called. So counter plus plus, and at the end we are going to log you have called me, then our counter variable times, like this. Now you can see this make counter function has a variable which is called counter, and we set its value to 0. Now this variable is only accessible by this function, and it is not accessible outside world. This means that we can create a function that keeps track of its own state without exposing it to anyone else. For example, let's create a function called counter by calling this make counter function. So let counter is equal to make counter, like this. And now we have a function called counter that we can use to count how many times it has been called. Now let's try it. Now we are going to call this function here multiple times, like this. Now if I hit save, you can see this counter function remembers the value of this counter variable, and it increments it every time when it is called. And this is possible because this counter function is a closure that has access to this counter variable in its scope. However, we cannot access this counter variable directly, as it is a private variable that is hidden from the outside world. This is a good way of encapsulating data and behavior, which is a key principle of object oriented programming. And we will learn about object oriented programming in future videos. And that's all I want to show you in this video. So we have learned how to create a function that returns a new function in JavaScript. We have seen that this is a very powerful and useful feature of JavaScript, as it allows us to create higher order functions, closures, and currying. We have also seen some example of how we can use these concepts to create reusable, modular, and encapsulated code. I hope you found this video helpful and informative. If you did, give us a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to join this web development journey with us. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Keep coding, keep creating, and I will see you in the next video.